Yeah.
Okay, and we are live. It's the Nonprofit Problem Solver podcast here on the YachtMe platform. This is a virtual events platform which is entirely free to nonprofits, which is just one of the reasons we've decided to use it for the podcast. It's got a lot of features that make doing a podcast or any sort of event very easy. So what you're seeing now, if you're watching live or watching the replay, is what we would call the main event mode. And then afterwards, we sort of recreate the tables that you would experience at a gala or gala, however you'd like to pronounce that, and we call that mingle mode, or I do. And so once this live session is complete, we will turn off the recording, and Rachel and I will join you backstage or in the tables for a further conversation if you'd like to stick around. In the meantime, feel free to throw comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to incorporate them into the conversation. So welcome, Rachel. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you, Kev?
I'm doing well, thank you. And I've been anticipating this topic for a long time because, as you know, throughout any sort of social media support forum for nonprofits or any sort of discussion, I've been spending a lot of time on Clubhouse recently, and you don't go very long without hearing the word grants, do you?
That's for sure.
So we're going to talk about the keys to success for grants. But before we do that, let me invite you, Rachel, to do a little intro background so everybody knows how wonderful you are.
Sure. Thanks. So my background is actually in public health, which obviously has become highly relevant to everyone's lives this year. But I have a master's in public health and have been working in the health and human services portion of the nonprofit sector for about 15 years. I used to work in nonprofits where I got to write a lot of grants, as a professional within nonprofits, sometimes writing grants for my own job, which I can empathize with those who do that. It's very stressful to
You
write
mean like finding your own salary?
Yeah, that will fund your position. And then you always have that inkling of wonder, what happens if this grant doesn't come through? Does that jeopardize my position? So we don't want nonprofits to feel that way. And certainly as a consultant now to nonprofits, I have the pleasure of helping coach nonprofits with their grants, the whole grants life cycle, which I know we're going to get into. Really help them figure out, who to apply to, how to maintain their grants, and the whole thing, as well as helping with needs assessments and strategic planning. So.
Right. And so where would people find you online?
Sure.
And let us know about any sort of programs or training that you do, or coaching or consulting.
Yeah, so you can find me and my company, Leading Healthy Futures, online at leadinghealthyfutures.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, where I spend a lot of time. And if you're interested in maybe working with me and learning a little bit more about how we can help your nonprofit kind of get to its next level of grants, if you're interested in what we chat about today, I do have an online self-directed course around grants called Grow Your Grants, and you can learn a little bit more about that at leadinghealthyfutures.com/course.
That's fantastic. Okay, well, let's jump into it then. So the keys to success with grants, and I know we've got a sort of before, during, and after sort of structure to how we're going to go through this, but even sort of the before,
yeah,
keys to success with grants and knowing when a grant is appropriate. The number of folks I speak to who are at an early stage, or maybe their nonprofit's been around for a while, but it's not sort of, let's say, seasoned or mature to a point where they are in a position to even begin to think of grants.
Yeah, I mean, not every nonprofit is ready for grants. That's really the reality. There are certainly nonprofits. I mean, number one, if you're a US based nonprofit, you would need to have 501c3 status. You need to actually be a nonprofit, and you need to do things. You need to have services and programs or initiatives or whatever it is that you're applying for grants for. But it really is a slightly more advanced stage of development to be ready for grants. A lot of organizations think it's like the panacea, is just like the solution to all of life's problems. And a lot of boards think that too, that they'll just run out and grab a few grants. But it is much easier to get your first big gift through a very engaged individual donor than it is to find that first fit in grants. So it's not necessarily the very first step for a nonprofit.
Right. So for the kids following at home, that is major grants, major gifts before grants, right?
Yeah, I mean, you want eventually to have a diversified funding pool. I'm sure you've talked to fundraisers of all types, and you want all of it in the mix. You don't want anything in just one bucket. But if you want something quickly, and you probably don't want grants.
Right. So, so again, let's just lay it down in clear terms. If you are waiting to get your 501c3 certification in the mail, then grants are really not on the cards. It's not as though you get your designation and then start submitting grants and all will be well. Now, having said that, there are some small local grants that are available. Not all grants are created equal. So I don't want to think that it's absolutely categorical. There are some easy to obtain, and I mean easy to obtain, 15 minutes, click in the right order online and submit some details, and maybe you'll get a few $100s, maybe even $1,000. But that's that's not really what we're talking about with grants, because that's not part of a grant strategy as such, is it?
Right. No, and really, it's important to sort of scale the amount of effort to the amount of the grant. It's not always one-to-one. There are, unfortunately, many funders, and there's some bad grant making practices out there in the world, unfortunately. But there are many funders who have very, very rigorous laborious requirements for like a $2,000 grant, which is very sad in my opinion, because it is not necessarily always worth a nonprofit's time in that circumstance. And there are also grants that are very simple to apply for that are many, many, many fold that. But I do think it's really important for people to be clear-headed about what is the grant you're applying for, and what does what amount of work, both on the front end, and we'll get to the after end. Is it worth it? You certainly don't want a situation where, you're spending, limited staff time, 2 days of work applying for a grant that's, $500.
Right. So, okay. Now let's walk through the whole process of grants, and because you and I both have a lot of experience in healthcare, let's just make believe that we are a health related or at least a human service nonprofit that covers a lot of ground. I know would still apply the principles we're going to talk about to animal welfare or environmental or arts and culture types nonprofits, but just in case we have to flesh out this example, we're going to try and make it a bit real. So with some sort of health service that we are trying to support in our community, and we have just formed, say, in the last 2 or 3 years. Any point at that, what do I need to have in place, or how can I advise my board or other people who are telling me to apply for grants, or I'm telling myself I should apply for grants? What do I need? At what point? What are some of the indications that think I might actually be ready to start thinking of that seriously?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, of course, to make sure that you have really, really clear understanding of your programs and services, so you know what you would be looking for in grants. So I think it's really, really important. I think of kind of your programs and services as really the center of the whole grants life cycle.
That's your core business. You need to, so you can't apply for grants, and then we're talking again substantial grants. Should we put a dollar figure on it? Are we talking about anything that's $10K or more?
It ranges so much for organizations. I have like a rule of thumb in my head that, I wouldn't in general, again, putting super easy proactive grants or who knows what aside, but in general, I would say under the 1% of your annual budget is probably too small for most organizations to be applying for, unless we're talking about like a hospital with millions of dollars of like reimbursement. Then we're talking about like in your philanthropy bucket under 1% of your sort of like philanthropic revenue bucket, let's call it that. So if you're an organization that has, you shouldn't be applying for grants in the like $2,000 range if you're an organization that's seeking to have an annual budget of like $5 million.
Right. Okay. But if we're talking about smaller organizations or new organizations really thinking about developing a grant strategy, and again, I would include in
Probably
that
like 5,000 or 10,000 would be a floor for a newer nonprofit that, again, there may be circumstances where there's a $2,500 grant that is worth it for some reason. But in general, 5 to 10,000 would probably be sort of the lower end of what a smaller nonprofit would be looking for. And then obviously upwards of 50, 100, into the six.
Sky is the limit, right? Once you get good at
you're
this
not ready
game,
for government grants, though. If you're the
in other words, listen to
the
end. Listen to the rest of this of the podcast. The first thing you need to understand is that you have to have your programs and services in place and know what you need the money for.
Yes.
Rather than, this is not a chicken and egg question.
Right.
Do I get the money and then do what they want me to do? Or you have to know what it is you are trying to do before you can look for what would be an appropriate grant.
Very much so.
And that's really, you're looking for an appropriate partner before you're looking for a dollar figure. Is that right?
All about the alignment and the match. And I know we're going to talk about that more. But yes, you need to have programs that not only what they are, what they do, but you have to have a really clear sort of operational understanding of what they are, because otherwise you're not going to be able to articulate that well in grants to the funder. So you want to really know, I like to think of the question words, who, what, where, when, why, how. Mm-hmm. If you can answer all of those about your programs and services really clearly, like who is doing this program? Why are we the organization to do this program? Where does the program happen? When does the program happen? If you have a very clear understanding of what your service delivery model is, or what your, what the thing you are seeking funding for is, and you can really describe it in those operational terms, then that you might be able to apply for a grant for it, because you can bet that they're going to ask some questions that require that clarity.
Right. And in terms of that, so the programs and services, should I be thinking of a grant to continue or expand, or do I want to broaden? Say I want to do more for the people that I serve, or do I want to, start seeing them earlier, start seeing them later? In other words, at what point am I asking
what we're already doing, or should it be for doing something
for newer stuff or something adjacent?
It's so interesting because that really depends on the funder, and that's part of figuring out that funder alignment. There are funders out there who wish to only fund new programs, new services, an expansion or growth aspect. And then there are ones that want to fund tried and true things. I would say, though, that no matter what you are proposing, it should be some sort of growth or expansion or improvement in some way. They need to know that the dollars are making things better, that they're not just, it's not very compelling to say that the dollars are just going to like plug a hole in your budget. So it's more compelling to articulate that how it's going to make things better, even if that just means we're going to be able to sustain this thing that otherwise we wouldn't be able to sustain, or we're going to be able to, make this thing that we just started a little bit more sort of like robust, continuous. We won't, it doesn't necessarily have to be new.
So it also doesn't have to be absolutely running smoothly, well-oiled machine. There could be some kinks in it. You're thinking, we've got it most of the way. We think, we're getting really good feedback. We're getting some results. We think these results actually should be better and could be better, but we need some additional investment to make that happen. And here's how we're going to test that and try and make that work a bit better. Here's what we've got in mind. That's a perfectly legitimate approach to make to a
very much. And some funders will in fact want that. Some funders will be seeking for organizations who say, I already do, diabetes self-management education, but I want to pilot a new thing where it's, led by people from within the community that I'm going to train. So I want funding for this training, or I want to incorporate a food pantry to it that gives, that provides nutritious food. So I want funding for that aspect of this program. I want to pilot it in a different location. All of those are the kinds of things that many funders like, but it's really about finding out, what do the funders you're applying to like? What makes them tick? What is their mission?
But still, isn't it, from the matching perspective, knowing what it is that you want to do and looking at who is sympathetic or has that appetite, rather than
the other way around.
You don't want to say like, oh, I've got a good relationship with this foundation or this grant maker, so I know I'm going to apply. They've invited me to apply, but actually they're looking at this, and I'm not sure that's 100% in line with what I want to do. But if I know I submit a grant, I've got a good application, a good chance of succeeding. Should I do it anyway? I think these are some of the judgments that people feel they need to make.
Yeah, I mean, usually we kind of start from, what are your programs and services, and then move on to kind of identifying the universe of potentially aligned funders and narrowing it into the funders that we think are well aligned, and then eventually kind of building the relationships with them so that you can find out if what you want to do and what they would want you to do is a match, and really thinking of it as a two-way street, and maybe having some other ideas for programs or expansion in your back pocket in case you are feeling from them like maybe it isn't a match. Maybe they would want you to do something a little bit different. And so then you have some other ideas that you can sort of bat around with them and figure out what's going to be the right one to apply to, if you're lucky enough to actually have that dialogue.
Right. Well, I want to take this sort of matchmaking metaphor a step further.
Yeah, I used that before.
Yeah. So, what is the process for filtering out and looking for a match? Is it grant speed dating, or some other format? And how long does it take? What's a reasonable expectation for when you can feel like you are okay? I've found a partner who I think is going to be sympathetic, and we're going to start really dating seriously now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so we think of sort of the first phase of the grants life cycle as just kind of identifying those well-aligned prospects. So this is a little bit more of like kind of the online dating phase, or something where you're just sort of like looking at profiles of funders and sort of
checking out right.
Yeah,
swiping
just
left, swiping right.
Yeah, exactly. Just the lay of the land. This is not where you actually have been talking to them or really learning about them. So the identifying well-aligned prospects, just sort of the grant prospect research phase, we like to use, there are many different databases. We like to use Foundation Directory Online, but using a database or some sort of list or source to kind of go through based on keywords, based on geography, based on the type of organization that you are, just kind of finding a list of potentially aligned funders based on these criteria. Also, who funds the organizations that are similar to you? If you are, a local community hospital, who's funding the other local community hospitals? If you are some sort of animal welfare organization, who else is funding the other animal welfare organizations that are similar to you? So find kind of like a list of, which again, we do this type of work with our clients, and I'm always happy to speak with people about doing customized grant prospect research, because it's an art and a science of sort of figuring out, don't just search a term like health, because you'll get thousands and thousands and thousands of results and you'll never be able to go through it. But you also don't want to have just like 2 results that come through. So get yourself a list through this research. It's sort of like your online dating list. And then
and by the way, so interrupt, can people who want to do that themselves, they don't have the money perhaps, but they've got the time, would they be able to access those resources, say at their local public library, or their local nonprofit community foundation might have some resources? Where would people go for help in that regard?
So certain things in some of these are free. So some level of searching in things like Foundation Directory Online are free. And there are subscriptions at higher levels, but there are organizations, as you've noted, that have those subscriptions for you. So some libraries, sometimes there are organizations like Forefront in Chicago, formerly known as Donors Forum, is an organization that provides this resource. They have things that you can, if you're a member, you can potentially, use that resource. So there are potentially a lot of organizations in your community, local coalitions and things like that may have a membership that you can use as one of their,
Okay. But
part of their coalition.
You get your list, rub your hands together, and then what?
Yeah, so you've got all of these, you got to filter through them really quickly because hopefully you have actually a fairly long list. We like to have several hundred on a list, and then you have to cull really quickly, a la your swiping left and right, kind of making those very quick judgments like, oh, smoker, no, that kind of thing. So you got to
White Sox fan. No.
Yeah, no, never. So you have to quickly swipe through, as it were, with these funders to sort of say, we don't want, they disallow hospitals and we're a community hospital. That's a no, or they don't allow research and that's one of the things that we do. That's a no. So just quickly, based on their face page, kind of judging. It's okay to judge in this scenario because don't waste your time writing a grant. These people who won't fund you.
The foundations themselves want those database screens to be up to date and clear about what they want and don't want. Otherwise, they get a lot of unsolicited material that's inappropriate and costly for them to handle. They only want the stuff that they want, right? 100%. So they're incentivized to give you the information you need to decide if they're worth your time or not. Exactly
right. It doesn't make any sense for you to be applying to funders who will never fund you and have tried to communicate that to you. So it does not make sense to put energy into those funders. So really trying to cull quickly. And then, those face pages on these databases are very valuable, but as you noted, they're only as valuable as up to date as they are up to date. So one of the important things is to, once you kind of have your shortened list, you actually then want to move on to looking at websites in 990s, get a little bit more information from them. I'm not sure what the dating equivalent is this. Maybe this is some sort of Facebook stalking or something. I'm not sure.
Facebook stalking. Okay. So
the website or something, I'm not sure. But you want to look at the websites of the funders because if they have one, you will have more information and you'll have more recent information. So for example, if they've got some new, COVID relief fund or, anti-racism stream or something that maybe has not made it onto these other platforms because this is a new thing that they developed in, 2020 or in 2021. That's really when you can find out some of those things, or like we're paused right now on giving out grants because we're doing a new strategic plan or something like that.
So this is, I'm going to use a technical term that is completely inappropriate for the filtering and swiping that we've just talked about, but people shouldn't be too over concerned about false negatives. In other words, someone who they've disregarded because of what it says on this database page, but that and worry that maybe they've dismissed somebody who could really be a match. They shouldn't really worry too much about that, right?
No, especially because if you do this sort of in a structured way as we do, you'll keep a list of all the foundations you considered and said no and why. You'll quickly keep that list, but you'll have somewhere the list of ones that you disregarded. So you can always go back to it later if there comes a circumstance where your board member says, Rachel, why did you not consider X, Y, or Z nonprofit? I just met them at some event or other. You can go back and say, it looked like they actually don't fund things in our geography. That's why I disregarded it. Or you can say, oh, maybe I shouldn't have disregarded it. Now that I took a closer look, we'll bring them back into the mix. So it's, but
so
yes,
it's not a filtering set in stone.
No, and I would really recommend people do this kind of structured grant prospect research every few years, maybe every 3 years, every 5 years, depending on sort of what you're seeking in terms of how many new funders you're trying to find. But it's a good thing to refresh every now and again, because you may find a funder you disregarded because they were not a match for you, either because they've changed or because you have new programs and you've changed. Maybe they are a match in the future. So this is the time to be fast going through things and not the time to worry about false negatives.
Okay, that was useful. Thank you. So the when you go to the websites, there are a couple of things I'm guessing that you want to be looking at,
Yes.
which is, do they have a current funding program that's available and open? And can I get some indication about how hard it is, how much time it's going to take, what information do I need to apply?
Yeah. But even before that, you really want to look at their mission and their grant making priorities
Oh, yes,
on
of
the,
course. Yes, you do.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah.
that's
Jumping
sort
the
of like,
gun. Sorry.
yeah. And obviously any exclusions, you're always looking for exclusions, because the first moment you see an exclusion that applies to your organization, you're out of there, right? If they do
Right.
not fund your organization, you can close the website right away.
So
So
take the exclusion seriously.
yeah, I mean, there are always like bubble cases or something where you might need clarity from an organization. But if it says we don't fund hospitals, don't think that you're going to negotiate with them around that.
We're the exception is
Right.
not a good strategy.
No, it is not. But really, I mean, even though it kind of goes without saying that the mission is something you should be looking for of the funder, I think that that's something that people sometimes neglect, is that it's really about the mission of the funder. We think of it in nonprofits as about our mission. And of course, they care about our missions, but they care about our missions insofar as they align with the funder's mission. The funder's mission is to give out money that aligns with its mission and its grant making priorities. So, if you are looking at that and you're thinking, I'm not sure if there's a way for me to describe my work in a way that aligns with that, that should give you pause.
So would a way to do that be to read their mission statement, for example, and say, yes, I see our organization in that. The program I would like to fund them to fund fits that. It is underneath that mission. And if it's not, then
if it's not, then right. Exactly. If it's not a fit.
Okay. So they do the mission test.
So, mission, grant making priorities, exclusions, you're looking at all of that. And yes, you are looking for what is their process? What is their deadline? Do they have, are there specific funding opportunities, that are, we do our arts funding only in April, and we do our, our health funding only in June. You're looking for those things on the website. And if they don't have a website, or if you just want supplemental information, you can look at the 990s for these funders. So that's their IRS documents. And you can learn some of this information, not in as user-friendly of a way, but you can find some of this information for organizations that don't have websites in their 990, like who they funded in the past.
Right. But you'll get some alignment stuff, but you won't get any of the processes or timescales or anything from a 990. That would
probably not. They do actually. Some of them have as an attachment to it. Some of them have their grant making like process. But that is typically not all that helpful in the 990. It's not as detailed usually.
Right. Okay. So just to summarize, what you're really looking for is you do the mission alignment test. If that's a go, then you do the exclusion test. If you're not excluded, then you look, do they have any current programs that would fit the time scale, and any other information about programs or funding that they've got that could be current.
And actually who they funded in the past and the amounts, because that will also really help you understand, if you see that they've funded the same organizations year after year for $5,000, but you're looking for a grant of $50,000, or you are very, very dissimilar from the organizations you see that they're funding, that gives you an inclination that maybe this isn't a fit. So yeah, that would be the last thing that I would look for. And you're still trying to do this pretty quickly. You're still trying to go through all of this on a website in 5 minutes. So do
you also want to be looking at if there's a named team or project manager or program manager who's looking after that? And then is that someone that you sort of, then you do the stalking on LinkedIn and think, okay, maybe I'll do a connection request and see if I can, spark off a conversation here and understand a bit more.
Or just send an email. If there's an email address, program officers at foundations really want to hear from you. That is their job. Their job is to learn about grantees and prospective grantees and to give out money. So you absolutely want to talk to them if you can. And so reaching out to whoever is listed is completely appropriate. I actually coach around that in my program, just sort of how to reach out to funders and things like that. But you do want to reach out to them, and if possible, have an introductory call, because that's where you really get, this is like your first date, this is where you kind of assess like, okay, is this really a fit? But you want to make sure you've done the groundwork beforehand so that you're not asking them questions that are plainly obvious, on their website, or you're not, asking things or falling into exclusions that you could have caught in 5 minutes of research.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And the, I'm just forgetting the question I was going to ask you about, the reaching out. It'll come to me anyway. Carry on. So
I was going to say, and a call with funder is really just like a introductory dialogue where you want to learn about each other. So you do want to be really well versed in your programs and kind of have an idea of what you're pitching. If you're pitching a program to them. But it's really about also listening and hearing from them. Are they hearing, are they perceiving your programs as in alignment with their mission? Are they, kind of sharing back to you, no, we're not really doing things in direct health services right now, or no, we're not really doing things in, that neighborhood right now, are, just sort of being prepared to listen really carefully and respond appropriately. Sometimes the response is, oh, well, actually, we have a different program that does that. Sometimes the response might be that they have misunderstood what you're saying, and you can very, very politely clarify, like, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear that this is a direct service program. Sometimes it's about making sure that they understand what your program is. And then also sometimes it's just making sure to phrase your programs and services in a way that, again, aligns with their mission. So I've given the example before. Let's say you've got some sort of like mental health group program for teen girls. You could apply to a funder whose mission is to empower women and girls. And then you sort of want to say, oh, we've got this great program that empowers women and girls through this group therapy program. But if you're applying to a funder that funds mental health services, you can still apply potentially for the same program, but you would probably lead with, we've got this great group therapy program that provides access to mental health services for teen girls. You're kind of
frame within their mission, not your own.
Exactly. And again, it's the same program. It does meet both funders' needs in that situation. You're not misportraying it, but it's just really making that connection crystal clear so that they're not doing the guesswork in their head of trying to figure out, like, is this going to fit with our funding priorities? Am I going to be able to fund it? Is it going to make sense for us?
Yeah, I remember the question I was thinking of, which relates to understanding more about the funders. Would you recommend, if possible, that they join, if they feel this funder is a potential fit, that they sign up to a newsletter or any sort of resources like that, or will they be bombarded by useless information?
That the nonprofits sign up for the funders newsletter?
Yeah.
Yes, that is a good idea. I thought you were saying, should the funder sign up for the
no. Should the nonprofit think, okay, I don't know whether they've got anything current now, and I don't see necessarily a name, but if I sign up for this newsletter, I will they will tell me what's up, what's coming in the near future, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, again, this is sort of at your own tolerance level. If you're looking at 50 different funders, you might not want to be on 50 different newsletters. But I do think for the funders that you think are going to be a really good fit, but there's nothing live right now, that's a great strategy. As is, again, those connection requests, reaching out on LinkedIn, or, if there are virtual or in-person networking events, trying to introduce yourself to people is a great fit. I actually, when looking at the websites, I wouldn't get too hung up on whether or not there's a live opportunity to apply. I know sometimes people do, but this is a long-term strategy, right? So if there's not a live opportunity to apply because their next funding cycle opens at the beginning of 2022, that just means that they're probably not your most urgent call to make, right? That you might have some things some other funders you want to attend to first, but it shouldn't take them off your list because you're still looking for funding next year and the year after that, right?
Right. So the whole perspective one should be taking, as with finding other partners in other elements, other aspects of our lives, yeah, is you're playing the long game. This is you're not sort of hoping for love at first sight.
Right. And I mean, again, as with dating, all different things can happen. So sometimes you happen across a funder, they love you, you love them, and you get a grant very, very quickly. Sometimes it's like years of sort of like crossing paths in different things before there actually is the right sort of timing of program and the funder's needs and all of that. So it can happen in a variety of different ways for different funders. Some you're going to have a long relationship with, some you're going to have a short relationship with. But it is about building relationships.
And that, I think it's an interesting perspective, is that when it shifts from I'm looking at the website, I don't really know anybody here, I'm just learning about this organization, to one where there is that sort of ongoing relationship, is not universalizing what happens with one foundation as though that's the rule for everybody.
Right.
So if someone says, yeah, we sort of don't we don't like those sorts of projects, or we only do this, or we actually have already funded one organization like yours in that neighborhood, so we're not going to do another one. That doesn't mean all funders think that they work on that sort of quota principle. Right. Everybody has their own appetite or way of thinking about how they distribute their funds.
Yes, and you'll learn some of that from a website. You'll learn some of that from talking to them, but it is very variable across funders. So you do really want to be aware of what is important to that funder. For example, there will be some that do not want to fund the same organization every year. Some even have mandatory, after 3 years, we make you take a year off because they want to make sure that they're funding other organizations. There are others that will fund the same organizations year after year after year. There are some that really want you to propose something new. There are others that want to make sure that you have evidence that you've piloted this, that you know what you're doing. So there's just a ton of variability, and it's really important to understand what that funder would wish.
Right. Okay. So what's next then? You get a short list of people after the websites. You feel like, okay, these are interesting opportunities, but they're not necessarily live, as you said.
Right. So you're going to want to, first of all, try to talk to them. And obviously some of them you may be successful at having that call. Some maybe you aren't able to have that call. But based on the conversations you have, or whether or not you're able to have a conversation, you're going to decide based on that and deadlines, which ones to be applying for. When, because you won't be able to apply if you're lucky enough to develop a list. We like to end our grant prospect research projects maybe with like 20 really well aligned funders that you have calls with, and maybe like 15, 18 of those you might end up applying to, maybe not quite as many. Out of those, you think about a nonprofit's schedule. A lot of nonprofits are not even going to be able to apply to that many in a year, let alone in a couple months. So you want to sort of prioritize what are the applications that you're going to work on. And then when you really have a sense, these are what we're applying for, you kind of move into that application phase.
And so when you prioritize, I've seen some people do a combination of things, and some people try and do this in a spreadsheet, and other people just do it, sort of
in their minds,
finger in the wind sort of thing. It's like, okay, what is the likelihood of success and how much is it? So, should I be going for smaller ones with less, with greater likelihood, or, a couple of larger ones perhaps that are harder ones? Like how do they manage that? And what other factors do you think of when you're trying to prioritize?
So I definitely think that dollar amount and alignment are probably the biggest ones, because a very, very well aligned, like large grant, obviously you want to put effort into that. And again, alignment includes this, like I've had a call with the funder and the funder said, yes.
And they've confirmed the alignment.
Yeah.
Right?
We want you to
you
apply.
want them
this
to say, oh, yes, you are aligned.
this program sounds right up our alley. We would love for you to apply at our next cycle. Then you should be applying. And so alignment and high dollar figure would definitely be part of that. Certainly, the easier the submission, the more that you should do it, in terms of, there's less of a reason to not do a grant submission that is straightforward, that you can use some of your kind of like core materials that you've written about before, which is one thing I recommend, is sort of having a repository of your core grant materials, make your life a little bit easier. You'll still want to customize for every single one, but at least you're starting from something really solid that is going to address the different questions.
Right.
So those would be some of the main ones. Certainly, how soon it's coming up. Something that is coming up too soon, like you talk to the funder and it turns out it's due on Friday, like that may be too soon for you to actually apply for. But, something that is, let's say, in the next 2 to 6 months, you would probably want to prioritize things that are coming up in the next, 2 to 6 months and have high dollar amounts, and also are super well aligned, especially if the applications are manageable.
Right. Okay. And obviously most nonprofits have some sort of internal process for proving how they do that and how they actually undertake grants, but that's something not everybody thinks about beforehand.
Yeah, and
there's a sort of mad scramble at the end, like who has to approve this, and is it good enough, and have I done the budget properly, and all these other sorts of questions.
That is such an important step of the application process that I think people forget about, is the internal approval process. And that I actually have that in my list of steps in writing a grant. It's like read the eligibility and the instructions again and again, and all the different steps in terms of writing and revisions. But internal approval is really important. And you should think about that at the beginning, because, hopefully if this is a one-page LOI, there's not a complicated internal approval process for this. We don't want people for a one-page letter to a funder having to like go to the executive director and the board and everybody over that. That seems like a lot. But on the other hand, there are applications that might require things like that. If you're doing large multi-year grants, federal grants, you're definitely going to want to have some sort of process by which the board even might be involved. And you also want to see if the funder requires anything quirky. There are sometimes funders that require a letter that has a board member's signature, or the CEO needs to include a letter of something or other. So there are times where the approval process isn't just a internal formality because you don't want your junior grant writer submitting things without anybody knowing about it,
Right.
where it's actually the funder requires certain things. So just make sure you know what is required beforehand, because otherwise you're going to end up the day before the grant, like struggling to find, that board member that has authorization to sign something.
So in order to affect this properly, you need a writing plan, basically a grant project plan, which, may just be a few lines in Excel with some timetables, but that, that I'm going to need access to this person, at some point 3 weeks from now, or whatever it is, and communicate that to those people so they know that they are involved in this project.
Exactly. And a couple other people you're always going to want to have involved in grant projects, assuming that the person I'm talking to, is the development team. The other people you would want are program and finance. You always want program and finance involved. So, one of the
as early as possible.
Yeah. One of the worst things is to apply for something and then you get awarded it, and the program people are like, what is this? I can't actually do this project. Or the finance people say, what is this? Like these dollar amounts have no relationship to reality.
Right. You thought we could get a computer for $5? Yeah. So yeah, and ultimately, to get it done properly anyway, you want your other team members, whether they are volunteers, working board, or however involved, because they all need to be behind what you are pitching.
Exactly. Right.
In order to make it to work, because the first thing that happens when you get the money is you should be ready to go when the check comes in, not going, how do we make this happen? There shouldn't be no mystery there, right? I guess
Right.
we're moving into the next phase of actually working on the grant now, right? When you get one.
Yes. And when you get the grant, yes, you want to immediately, I mean, first celebrate, but celebrate with the whole team, inform everyone, make sure program and finance know about this because they're going to need to. The finance team is going to need to be, depositing the check and making sure that it's actually put towards the right line items and that it's recorded appropriately. So it's not a reporting nightmare. And to avoid other reporting nightmares, you also want to make sure in terms of all of your evaluation measures and all the things that you said you would be able to do, the program people should know about this from the beginning because they should have been involved in the writing. But
Right.
if for some reason they weren't, or things have changed a lot, or it's one of those grants that takes 9 months to fund and nobody remembers what was in it, you need to talk to the program people immediately about what actually is in this grant. What are the expectations for the outcomes in it? Are there baseline measures that we need to start collecting like today because we need to do it before we implement the program? Or are there, you don't want to find out that the program people are like, these are not things that our systems can track. So hopefully you've solved that again before you submit the grant.
Before you submitted, right?
But if you haven't, the second best time to find out is immediately after being awarded so that you can at least kind of start the process of putting those into place, or can say to the funder like, oh, we thought we were getting a new electronic medical record system that would allow us to track this. We didn't actually get that in the last year. So we're going to pivot this and have a dialogue with the funder about how a couple of your measures are shifting.
Right. Right. And then finance also needs to understand, or your accounting or bookkeeping, about what the restrictions are on the grant, because it's not free money.
It is not free money.
You've submitted a budget, and there are limitations on what you can spend each dollar and penny on.
And this is even if it's a general operations grant that doesn't have a lot of limitations, you still want to make sure that it's tracked in your financial reporting system, like associated with that funder and that opportunity, so that you would be able to say what it was spent on, even if it can be spent on anyone's salary, or even if it can be spent on, facilities rent, even if the limitations are not that limiting, you still need to know what they were because they may ask you to report on that. And so it's so important for programmatically and fiscally to be able to actually know, did you do what you said you would? Did you spend the money the way you said you would? Can you report on that? Rather than just saying, well, we got $10,000 and we spent more than $10,000 last year, so I guess we spent it. That is not going to cut it.
That's not good, right? It just went into the pot.
Right.
So a lot of the problems in affecting a grant, in other words, delivering on what you said you were going to deliver, can actually be solved ahead of time if you involve the right people and do the right thinking. Now, some people may not have received a grant before, or received a grant from this particular foundation, and not be familiar with setting up a program. But word of warning: these issues we're talking about with programming and budgeting can all be solved ahead of time to a certain extent, and they shouldn't be surprises when the grant's awarded. But if they are, you need to solve them ASAP.
Right. And if there are times when challenges arise over the course of the grant that are completely understandable, or where, things do have to change for real reasons. I mean, just think of the last year or so. If you were someone who got funded at the beginning of 2020 to go do a bunch of really cool in-person programs over the course of 2020, that may not have happened. And none of your funders would have been, they live in the same world we do. So they will not have been surprised if you come to them and say, we have to change our in-person diabetes self-management program to virtual because of COVID, or there will be times where, you thought it would only take you 3 months to hire a position that this would fund. It took you 6 months. And so maybe you need to shift some dollars around. Funders are people. They are understanding. They don't want to take the money back because it's an administrative hassle for them. So in general, they will want to allow you to make changes over the course of a grant if the changes are for good reasons, and if they're not necessarily like shifting the real true meaning of what you're doing with the grant. If you're still fulfilling their mission and their grant making priorities, they don't want you to move your diabetes grant money to like something completely unrelated, to K through 12 arts programs, because they're an organization that funds diabetes programs, right? But if it's like, oh, we needed to slightly shift it around because of this very real world situation, 9 times out of 10, 99 out of 100, they're going to understand. And it's just good to communicate that upfront and early, rather than waiting till the report comes around, tell them that you use their money differently. That's not cool.
Right. So in other words, you can expect some flexibility and understanding around real world operational issues, things outside of your control, genuine surprises, the realities of running a program. What's not acceptable is not being prepared,
right? Mishandling
to manage the grant, and secondly, to not communicate as you problem solve through the year, and make adjustments, and not and rely only on a narrative report to communicate that.
That should not be the first time they're finding out about you needing to switch around the use of the funds. It should not be in a written thing. You had no other communication with them. So that is really a best practice. And again, they want to be fulfilling their mission. So they're going to be generally supportive of it, but you have to respect that the money was for something very specific. And so you can't just, go use it for something else without checking with them first.
Right. Okay. So it seems, anything else in terms of how you manage it, or are we ready to move into the sort of how you report on it and the sort of, I guess you would call it after, but
yeah, I think we're at reporting. And I mean, really the key to reporting again is to have done a good job in administering the program. So I know that sounds really, really simplistic, but the best way to report and to win your second year of funding is to have actually followed through on your first year successfully and be able to articulate what you did, the metrics that you promised in the grant originally. You can actually report on them. Whether you hit all of them or not, it's more about actually being able to say why you did or didn't hit some. If some fell short, again, that's the kind of thing that funders live in the real world. They want to learn from your experience. They want to maybe share struggles that you've had with other grantees, or maybe that's something that they want to use in order to change how they deliver their grants. If they realize that nobody can successfully do something, they probably want to learn from you. So your reporting is not only your place to sort of shine, tell the funder like, hey, we did a super good job with year one, you should probably fund us for year two, but it is also an opportunity to provide bigger lessons about the sector that you might know because you're on the ground and they're not, things that you might want them to share with other grantees or with the world. So it is actually doing a good job with the reporting is actually a real win for nonprofits on every level.
And again, if you're communicating with your audience all the way along, that's a lot easier to do in terms of completing it. That the person reading it at the other end understands what's going on, because this isn't news to them. This is really just capturing what they know has been going on all along. And really what you're doing is giving the relationship treating it like a genuine relationship. You don't just sort of, call somebody once a year with a Christmas card or something. Exactly. This is actually maintaining that dialogue all the way along, because you want it to be fluid. If your programs are working, they're not going to be set in stone or not progress, not evolve. As you learn more about the people that you serve, you might want to add this, add that, extend it here, start earlier, finish later, work to another group, take it to another community. There's all these different things that you can do to grow your program. And you want somebody who's going to be there with you because they've sensed some ownership in the struggle.
That's exactly right. And having them as a real partner makes that year 2 or year 3 grant, assuming they're a funder that does that much easier, because then, you're being able to say to them, like, we're thinking that next year we're going to be able to grow to do
For
this,
this, right.
or we're thinking the next year we want to launch a new that. Again, you should always be proposing something newer, improved, or better, even if it's basically still like it's the same program, but we want to become more efficient about X, or it's the same program, but we thought that like, we would have later hours on Wednesdays to make it more accessible. Just being able to articulate, we learned from the year, we learned from our partnership with you, and we want to improve in year two. It can be such a good conversation to have that follow-up conversation, that later on, when you've already been funded and you're kind of doing that same kind of relationship building call with the funder, but you're doing it as a grantee that's seeking the next year. It can be really, fulfilling. And I have had clients that have just built great relationships with funders where it becomes almost like, depending on the foundation, almost like an individual donor, where you have this kind of just like relationship where you can talk to them and say, oh, we just really want you to know about this cool new thing that we're doing, or this wonderful new hire. We'd love for you to attend this thing if you're willing. It becomes that kind of a relationship.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because as you were talking, I was thinking about how having that level of relationship and dialogue with a grant maker spills over into the way you would engage individual donors.
Yes.
And how having that solid relationship with the grant maker, then let's say that fully funds that particular program, but it still allows you to reach out to individual donors and fund, put money into next year's budget already, or to expand on it. And it's not, they're not one or the other. They can actually be funding the same thing.
Absolutely. And I always think of kind of funding as sort of like building a quilt. Like, you want to be asking each different sort of individual or foundation for sort of their own piece of it. If you're asking them for specific things, you sort of want to be asking them for their own specific piece of things, so that it makes sense from your financial reporting standpoint that they're separate, but that they all contribute to one large quilt, so that at the end of the day, you end up with the whole quilt, and you're not sort of just having like individual disconnected pieces, or you got too many of the same piece.
Right. But all in from beginning, reaching out for grants, executing on the grants that you are successful with, reporting on them, and maintaining that relationship. None of that is this opportunistic, spontaneous scramble of, doing it for the. This is a reasoned, intentional,
yes,
slow burning, long game of how you get sustainable funding for programs through grants.
Yes. It's very much a long game. And there are things that you can do all along the way. We didn't really have time to get into some of like developing core grant materials, but making sure you have all of sort of like your basic materials. I hate the term boilerplate, but I use it sometimes. Content.
It's a 80-20, right? You have 80% of what you're going to put in is the same.
Yes.
You want to start that with that expectation, and 20% is customized.
Exactly. You have your attachments on file. I actually have a resource on my website about the top things you can do today to be, ready for grants tomorrow. So, things that you can do when maybe you have a few minutes and you don't have a grant that's due, tomorrow, so that you aren't scrambling at the last second to find those attachments or to find out, information from your program people. There are things that you can do and be really planful, sort of like day in and day out, to sort of make your whole grants program really run a lot more smoothly.
But realistically, like you were saying earlier, around prioritizing those grants that are 2 to 6 months ahead of time.
Yeah.
And realistically, getting that done, if you've identified someone and they've got a funding opportunity within that window, by the time they've accepted your application and they've processed it, and maybe there's another round of information, and maybe there's other steps to that process before they make an award, you're talking about next year's funding, right?
You are always pretty much talking about next year's funding, almost always. Yeah, because even funders with short turnaround times, if you're lucky and there's something due really soon, and it's the kind of funder that gives you an answer in a few weeks, or just like 2 or 3 months, you're still talking about potentially 6 months from when you started like looking for funders. So you're really always thinking about funding for next year's budget. Oh,
sorry.
it's nearly time.
Yeah.
Next year's budget, and that's really the reality, is that grants are not fast. They are not they're not your like immediately plug a hole in a hemorrhaging budget. You can use other types of funding for that, but for grants, it's really more like slowly over time building up sort of like a base of funding, because we're really already looking at next year.
Right. Okay, that's excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, we've run a full hour, so we're not going to break into mingle mode today. We'll do that. I think you're going to have to come back another time and flesh out some of these details. But if you remind us before we close again what you've got online, what your programs are, and how people can reach out and find you.
Absolutely. So I love to help organizations not only with grants, but also needs assessments and strategic plans. You can learn more about that on my website, leadinghealthyfutures.com. And we have some information specifically about our online program, Grow Your Grants, at leadinghealthyfutures.com/course.
Okay, that's fantastic. And people can get can follow you on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn, Rachel Sachs, and I would be delighted to connect with you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. I've learned some, and I'm sure there's a lot of material for people to address their own grant strategy and put their perspectives in order, shall we say?
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening to the Nonprofit Problem Solver podcast here on YAPME, and thanks to PodPro Audio, making professional podcasting easy. And we will see you next time on the Nonprofit Problem Solver. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.